Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice, for being there to call out to your mom. How heartbreaking was that? Call out for your mom. I can't breathe. But because of you and because of thousands, millions of people around the world who came out for justice, your name will always be synonymous with justice.
So, Dr. Hamilton, I'm curious, you know, how you see this dichotomy, because in the way I see it, a lot of progressive activists are perfectly aware of what neoliberal means and the problems that it's created, austerity programs, et cetera. But when you talk to folks in the establishment, whether they're Democratic politicians or mainstream media folks, I'm not even sure they're aware of what neoliberal means, let alone the harms that it has caused. Do you see that dichotomy?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, and what we're working against is a long trajectory of a social movement that has got us here. So we view the world as being solved by market and marketized solutions to the extent of whether the problems are economic or otherwise, and can't imagine anything else. It's almost a religion, right? So it's almost as if we have adopted some notion that the best way for people to engage in society is to be incentivized by or sanctioned by this proverbial market. And what the problem of this framework is, and that thought, is that it has no notion of power, no notion of the fact that, and I'm an economist, so I might get jargony, we're not all just simple price takers or running around as unfettered agents that are guided by some free will into fair and efficient distribution. That's a religion almost. That is a fantasy. And you know, whether you're on the right side or the left side, one thing that we should all agree upon is that anytime somebody engages in a transaction and they have nothing by which to negotiate with or transact with, in other words, if you're trying to negotiate with your employer and you're faced with that threat of unemployment, that if you don't accept the terms of that job, you're gonna not be able to feed your family, that's not a fair exchange. You are simply at the whim of exploitation or the whim of charity. So reimagine a world where, regardless of ideology, that people have a basic right, a basic economic right to certain things like a job, like income, like healthcare, like the right to schooling. This is not so radical. This is justice. And that is largely what the course is about.
And by the way, if you guys want to find it on our website, go to tyt.com and click on shows. New School's right above Old School. Okay, so we have a show called Old School, and Visions of a Post-Neoliberal Future are from the New School, quite literally. So you know what you mentioned there, Derek. It's basically a worldview. You know, you call it almost a religion, but it's a world. It's how they see the world, and they've united around that idea, and it drives them. So. And neoliberal, to me, unfortunately, is a confusing term because people think, oh, liberal, a lot of folks haven't caught on. They think that means the left and that means progressive, when it doesn't mean that at all, right? And a lot of Republicans are neoliberals and unfortunately corporate Democrats. But what I was gonna lead to there is it hurting the left politically that they will not acknowledge, the Democratic establishment will not acknowledge the concept of neoliberalism? So it's driving the electorate to, well, I know that isn't working for me. I know I don't have the same economic power as my boss. I know that they say there's not enough money for my wages, but I just saw the boss got $60 million exit package, right? And when the Democrats, the establishment Democrats tell folks, no, don't believe your lying eyes, everything is great. Does that drive people to the right? And hence is terribly counterproductive?
You know, I would have to agree with that. I mean, nobody wants to be a victim, and the rhetoric around people having choice and agency and freedom, and that's what the right was really good at, and that's how the right was pretty successful in adopting this notion of freedom, adopting this concept of, even the word liberalization, free of the tyranny of government. But it's an inadequate notion of freedom. It's a notion of whether we actually have achieved it or not, political freedom, civil freedom. But the element of freedom that's negated and not paid enough attention to is economics, the actual having some power, some resources to begin with. So, to me, that is the problem. And that is the left trying to avoid sounding with that dirty word in our society, socialism versus capitalism, which I would say are largely academic concepts to begin with. In practice, there is no capitalism when we bail out the banks as a result of the Great Recession. That's not capitalism. And obviously Social Security is one of the most successful programs in America, and that is a government-run program. So I'm being long-winded, but let me sum it up. I think when we get back to a notion of an economic rights framework, an inclusive economic rights framework, that takes us out of the partisan divides, because what it is saying is that I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. Now I care, I have a preference, I have a view of the world order. But again, I like to emphasize that if we're talking about fairness, then people should not be hungry. If we're talking about fairness, then people should be able to get educated. And then if you want to have a market economy, go at it. If you want to have some deregulation, go at it. But let's ensure first and foremost that government fulfills its fiduciary responsibility, which is to its people, and make sure that people have adequate income, a job. I'm redundant, but these are basic rights that I think take us out of the partisan divides.
Yeah, look, I've said it 1,000 times on the show, but if my dad didn't get a free college education back in Turkey in the 1960s, we'd still be olive farmers in southeastern Turkey, right? So that gave you equality of opportunity. And here, this many years later, 60 years later, in America, in the richest country in the world, we can't get anywhere near the opportunity my dad had as a farmer in Turkey. That's unbelievable. And it's impossible to make the case that we don't have enough money. Richest country in the history of the world. So, but I gotta ask you again, not again, but like to follow up on those questions. How do we get there? I know that that's not necessarily what everybody's talking about in the series, and there's a number of different speeches, right? But in your opinion, Dr. Hamilton, how do we get to that neoliberal future? Or past the neoliberal?
I use the word religion on purpose because it's a view that is unchallenged. It is a dogma. But how do we get there? Well, first we commit to justice. First we realize that it is our government, it is our economy, and it is our monetary system that can facilitate our government to fulfill the economy we want. In other words, we get to define what the economy is. We get to choose if we're gonna emphasize GDP per capita without any notion of distribution or equity, or if we want to choose an economy that really promotes economic inclusion and everyone civically engaged and social equity. We get to choose. So that's thing one. And then thing two, we need to recognize, well, what is the big obstacle? Race. The ways in which we subdivide people and are able to abstract from a politically dominant group in a way that seemingly is against their interests. So I'll try to break that down. People not only care about where they are in a vertical dimension, they also care about their horizontal positioning. So the more despair we have, the more inequality we have, the more someone can come along and talk about building walls to solidify something like the property rights and whiteness, to solidify the relative status of a dominant political group. So to get to this gold star, we need a society that facilitates economic rights, just like political rights and civil rights. And we need a society that commits to justice because it's the right thing to do, so that we're not vulnerable to fascism because of economic despair and being able to pit one group against the next.
Yeah, that's exactly what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about right before they assassinated him. And by the way, also what Fred Hampton was talking about right before they assassinated him. So, and I want people to understand what Dr. Hamilton talked about there. Just real quick, I know we're out of time, but I'm reading the book *Sapiens*. I know I'm 7 years late, but and it's a great book. Everybody should read it. And one of the things that it clarifies is that different societies throughout different areas and different time periods have stratified in different ways. So in India, for example, there's a caste system. From where I'm from, the Ottomans, they did it based on religion. So the Muslims would be at the top, and then you'd have a certain stratification. Unfortunately, in America, we did that same exact thing, but we did it by race. And so that is why race still haunts us to today, and that is why it is intertwined with economic issues, because it was supposed to be intertwined. And that's what led to the stratification in the first place.